Most people have no idea what's about to happen next. Trump just made an announcement that's not about politics, it's about power, and it could rewrite how America works for the next decade. What if I told you that everything from the housing market to the job you have, or the retirement you've been counting on, is about to shift because of this one move? Today, I'm going to break down what's really behind Trump's latest statement, the hidden chain reaction it's already triggering in Washington, and why even his critics are quietly preparing for what comes next. Let's start with what he actually said, because beneath the headlines, there's a much bigger signal most people missed. You know how sometimes you hear a news story and your gut tells you there's more to it than what they're showing? That's exactly what happened when Trump spoke to reporters on Air Force One recently. The cameras were rolling, the questions were flying, and then he said something that made political insiders sit up straight. He didn't just criticize a member of his own party. That happens all the time in Washington. What he did was draw a line in the sand about who stays in his movement and who gets pushed out. And the way he did it told a story that goes way beyond one person or one disagreement. The congresswoman in question was Marjorie Taylor Greene, someone who once stood right beside him at rallies, defending him when almost no one else would. But in recent months, she'd started breaking ranks, appearing on liberal networks, questioning his focus on foreign policy, even siding with Democrats on a few high-profile votes. Then came the final straw. She posted a screenshot of her private text exchange with Trump after he pulled his endorsement. For him, that was it, the ultimate act of disloyalty. So, aboard Air Force One, he made it official. He mocked her as Marjorie Taylor Brown, said she had turned left, and made it clear she was out of the MAGA movement. Within hours, he was already hearing from challengers ready to run against her in Georgia. But here's the thing, this wasn't really about her. It was about sending a message to every other Republican in Congress: stay loyal, or this could be you next. When you control a political movement, loyalty isn't just preferred, it's required. And Trump was reminding everyone watching that he still controls that movement, not the party establishment, not the media, not anyone else. At the exact same time, Trump redirected attention away from the scandal of the weak new Epstein file leaks meant to smear him and called the entire narrative a hoax. Then he pivoted instantly to what he said actually mattered: affordability, cost of living, and putting Americans first. That was the chess move. While critics thought they had him cornered with controversy, he changed the entire board. Think about how that works in real life. Imagine you're in a conversation where someone's trying to make you look foolish by bringing up your past mistakes. You have two choices. You can spend all your energy defending those mistakes, letting them control the conversation, or you can acknowledge it briefly and immediately shift to what you're doing now and what you're planning for the future. The second strategy doesn't let them set the terms of the discussion. You do. That's what Trump did. And it's why so many political operatives, regardless of what they think of him personally, were taking notes. Now, why does any of this matter to you? Because beneath all the political theater, there's a much more important story unfolding. And it's about something that affects every single person watching this video, especially if you're in or approaching retirement. Let's talk about what's happening in the real world, your world, while Washington plays these games. If you've been to the grocery store recently, you've felt it. If you've checked your retirement account, you've seen it. If you've looked at housing prices or tried to help a grandchild find an affordable place to live, you know exactly what I'm talking about. The systems we built our lives around, the ones that promised if you worked hard, saved smart, and played by the rules, you'd be secure, those systems are starting to crack. Mortgage rates have climbed to levels we haven't seen in over a generation. The house you bought decades ago for a reasonable price, young families today can barely afford the down payment on something half that size. Your retirement savings, even if they've grown on paper, don't seem to buy as much as they should. Healthcare costs keep rising. Insurance premiums keep rising. Everything keeps rising except the sense of security. And here's the emotional core of it that doesn't get talked about enough in the news. You did everything right. You worked for decades. You saved. You sacrificed. You put off vacations and luxuries to build something solid for yourself and your family. And now, watching the value of that hard work feel less and less certain, that's not just financially frustrating, it's personally painful. It feels like the promise got broken somewhere along the way. Trump's announcement, for all its political noise, speaks directly to that frustration. Whether you support him or not, his strategy positions him as the one willing to say out loud what a lot of people are feeling quietly. The system isn't working for regular folks anymore, and something needs to reset. He's not the first politician to tap into that feeling, not by a long shot. But the way he's doing it right now, in this moment, with this particular combination of personal power plays and economic messaging, is setting up something bigger than just another election cycle. Because here's where the story gets really interesting. This announcement wasn't spontaneous. It wasn't an off-the-cuff reaction. When you look at Trump's entire political history, you start to see a pattern. And once you see the pattern, you realize this latest move fits right into it like a puzzle piece you didn't know was missing. Let me show you what I mean. Go back to his first term. Think about the tariffs he imposed that economists said would crash the economy. They caused chaos in the markets for a while. Companies panicked. The media ran endless stories about trade wars. And then, quietly, behind all that noise, negotiations happened on his terms. Other countries came to the table differently than they would have if he'd played by the traditional diplomatic rulebook. Or think about his border policies, the controversies, the court battles, the protests, massive disruption, but underneath it all, a repositioning of what was politically possible to even discuss in Washington. Before his approach, certain conversations were considered completely off-limits. After, even his opponents had to engage with the topics on terms he'd set. This isn't about whether those policies were good or bad, that's a different conversation. This is about recognizing a strategy. Create a controlled chaos that forces everyone else to react on your timeline, not theirs. And in that reaction, you gain leverage you wouldn't have had by playing it safe. The latest announcement fits that pattern perfectly. By publicly cutting ties with a member of his own party while simultaneously dismissing scandal attempts and pivoting to economic populism, he's created multiple pressure points at once. Republicans in Congress have to choose sides. Democrats have to figure out if their scandal approach is actually working or just generating noise. And the media has to decide what story to tell, knowing that whatever they focus on, he's already 2 steps ahead planning the next move. It's exhausting to watch, honestly, but it's also effective in ways that traditional politics isn't anymore. Because traditional politics assumes everyone's operating from the same playbook, following the same unstated rules. Trump throws that playbook out and writes his own. And whether that's genius or recklessness kind of depends on what he does with the leverage once he has it. Which brings us to something fascinating that's happening right now, in real time, that most people aren't noticing. The silence. You'd think with an announcement this provocative, the media would be wall-to-wall coverage, the political establishment would be shouting from every platform, the talking heads would be analyzing it to death. And sure, there's coverage, but there's also a strange quiet from certain corners that are usually the loudest. Some major media outlets that spent years criticizing Trump's every move are suddenly more measured, more cautious. Some political insiders who used to predict his downfall with absolute certainty are hedging their language. Some corporations that signaled strong opposition are staying neutral. Why? Because behind the scenes, people are reading the situation differently than they're letting on publicly. They're seeing polls, they're seeing economic indicators, they're seeing voter sentiment, and they're recalculating what the landscape looks like going into next year's election. The narrative they thought was settled, Trump is a fading political force mired in legal troubles, isn't playing out that way. And smart political operators, regardless of party, are adjusting their strategies accordingly. Think about it like this. Imagine you're in a poker game, and you've been betting heavily that someone has a weak hand, but then they start playing aggressively, raising the stakes, and showing no signs of backing down. At a certain point, you have to consider maybe they're not bluffing, maybe you misread the table. And if you did, you need to change your strategy before you lose everything you put in the pot. That's what's happening in Washington right now. The silence isn't apathy, it's recalculation. And that recalculation is happening because insiders are watching internal party reactions that the public doesn't see. Republicans who were quietly hoping Trump would fade away are realizing he's not just staying relevant, he's consolidating control. Democrats who thought scandal after scandal would finish him politically are seeing those scandals fail to move the needle the way they used to. For those of you who remember politics in the 70 seconds, 80 seconds, 90 seconds, this might feel familiar in a strange way. Think about Nixon going to China, completely unexpected, controversial even among his own supporters, but it fundamentally changed global politics. Think about Reagan's economic approach, dismissed by experts as reckless, but it reshaped the conversation around government's role in the economy for decades. Trump's announcement might be playing a similar role, just in a different era with different tools. It's less about ideology, more about leverage. Less about policy specifics, more about positioning for whatever negotiation comes next. And here's where I want to pause and ask you something directly, because I think this matters more than we're admitting. What happens when power stops hiding behind the polite language of politics and just presents itself as raw positioning? When politicians stop pretending their moves are about principles and start being open about the fact that it's all about winning? Does that make things more honest or more dangerous? I think about this a lot, honestly, because there's something almost refreshing about politicians who don't pretend anymore. At least you know what you're dealing with. But there's also something unsettling about it, like we're admitting that the ideals we taught our kids about public service and doing the right thing were just stories we told ourselves. Both sides do this, by the way. It's not a left or right thing. Democrats wrap their power moves in the language of justice and protecting democracy. Republicans wrap theirs in freedom and defending values. But underneath, it's the same thing, competing for control and using whatever moral language works to justify it. The Epstein files are a perfect example. Democrats are releasing them strategically, timing the leaks to maximum political damage, claiming it's about transparency and protecting victims. But if it were really about victims, wouldn't they have pushed for this years ago when they had full control of government? Wouldn't they have held hearings and demanded accountability across the board, regardless of party? Instead, what we're seeing is selective outrage. Release the documents that mention Trump. Redact the ones that might implicate powerful Democrats or donors. Frame it all as a moral crusade, while really, it's just opposition research with a noble-sounding cover story. And Trump's response? He calls it a hoax, dismisses the whole thing, and says we should focus on what really matters to families: affordability, jobs, security. That sounds good too, right? Except he's also using that message to deflect from legitimate questions about his past associations. So his framing is strategic too. Neither side is being fully honest. Both are using morality as a weapon. And the casualty in all of this is trust itself. Trust that our leaders are actually working for us and not just playing an endless game of political chess where we're the pawns. Here's what I think is worth understanding, though. When you strip away the moral posturing from both sides, you're left with something simpler and maybe more important. Who's actually preparing for what comes next? Not who's winning today's news cycle or tomorrow's Twitter battle, but who's positioning for the real structural changes that are coming whether we like it or not. Because while everyone's arguing about who knew Epstein or who's more corrupt, there are actual economic and technological forces building that are going to reshape everything. And whoever understands those forces and plans for them is going to have enormous influence over what the next decade looks like. Trump's announcement, when you look past the drama, includes hints about his economic strategy. He's talked about forcing a return to domestic manufacturing. He's talked about using tariffs not as punishment but as negotiation tools to bring production back to America. He's talked about confronting how much of our economy got outsourced to countries that don't share our interests. Now, whether that's realistic or not, whether it would work or cause more problems, that's legitimately debatable. Economists are all over the map on it. But the instinct behind it, the idea that America gave away too much economic leverage and needs to reclaim it, that resonates with millions of people who watch their jobs disappear overseas and their communities hollow out. For those of you who lived through the 1,980 seconds manufacturing collapse, you remember what that felt like. Factories that had been in your town for generations suddenly closing. Workers with decades of experience finding themselves with skills the new economy didn't value. Communities built around those jobs losing their centers of gravity. The promise was that free trade would make everyone better off in the long run. And maybe it did for some people in some places, but for a whole lot of Americans, it felt like a betrayal. Trump's economic message taps directly into that memory. He's essentially saying, we're going to reverse that. We're going to rebuild what was lost. And whether he can actually deliver on that is one question. But the fact that he's one of the only politicians even promising to try, that's why his support remains strong, despite everything else. The announcement signals he's planning to make that economic message central again. Not just immigration, not just cultural issues, but hard economics, jobs, manufacturing, independence from foreign supply chains. In a world where we learned during COVID how vulnerable we are when everything's made somewhere else, that message has new weight it didn't have a few years ago. But here's the catch. Even if Trump succeeds in forcing some manufacturing back, even if he negotiates better trade deals, even if he creates the conditions for an economic revival, none of that matters if people don't believe it's real. And that brings us to maybe the biggest problem in America right now, bigger than any policy disagreement. The trust collapse. Think about all the institutions that people used to trust, without question. The media, most people now assume they're being manipulated or lied to, and honestly, they're often right. The medical establishment after COVID, millions of people question everything they're told about health. The financial system, after the bank bailouts and the way inflation hit regular people harder than wealthy investors, trust is gone. Government itself, barely a quarter of Americans think Washington is working for them instead of special interests. Churches, schools, corporations, experts, every major institution has seen trust plummet, and once trust is gone, it's incredibly hard to get back, because everything gets viewed through suspicion. Even when someone's telling the truth, people assume there's a hidden agenda. Even when data clearly shows something, people assume the data was manipulated. Even when genuine good intentions exist, people assume it's performance. Trump's whole political existence rides on that trust collapse. His supporters don't trust him because he's more honest or more moral than other politicians. Many of them openly admit he's not. They trust him because he attacks the same institutions they've lost faith in. He says out loud what they're thinking. He doesn't pretend to be something he's not. In a world where everything feels fake, his authenticity, even if it's authentically flawed, feels more real than polished politicians reading carefully focus group talking points. That's a massive shift in how leadership works. It used to be that leaders gain trust by demonstrating expertise, consistency, dignity. Now, leaders gain trust by demonstrating that they're against the same things their supporters are against. It's bonding through shared opposition rather than shared values. And that has huge implications for what kind of country we're becoming and what comes next after this announcement. Because if Trump does consolidate power again, he'll be operating in an environment where traditional credibility doesn't matter anymore, where norms and precedents are seen as obstacles rather than guardrails, where moving fast and breaking things, to borrow a phrase from tech, is valued more than careful deliberation. Some people find that exciting. Finally, a leader who'll actually do something instead of just managing decline. Finally, someone who'll take on the bureaucracy and the special interests and the comfortable elites who've been running things into the ground. Other people find that terrifying. A leader with no respect for limits, operating in a system where trust and expertise have collapsed, could do enormous damage before anyone could stop them. Both perspectives have merit, honestly. And which one you lean toward probably depends on whether you think the current system is worth preserving or needs to be torn down and rebuilt. But here's what I think is worth considering. Regardless of where you fall on that spectrum, every time there's a major collapse in how things work, whether it's trust or economics or institutions, there's an opening for something new. And what fills that opening isn't predetermined. It could be something better. It could be something worse. It depends entirely on whether people are paying attention and making conscious choices or just reacting emotionally to whatever's in front of them. Trump's announcement is part of that bigger moment. The political drama is just the surface. Underneath, what's really happening is a reshaping of how power works in America, who has it, and how it gets used. So let's talk about what that might actually look like in practical terms for your life. Short term, we could see more volatility. Markets don't like uncertainty, and Trump's approach creates a lot of it. Don't panic, but do pay attention. Medium term, watch the political realignment. The old categories of Republican and Democrat are breaking down. It's becoming more about establishment versus populist, insider versus outsider. That realignment will affect everything from local elections to what policies actually get passed. Stay informed. Don't just assume the party you voted for your whole life still represents what you think it does. Long term, we're looking at a fundamental restructuring of how Americans think about wealth, work, and independence. The promise that college and a corporate career equals security, that's over for most people. The promise that government will take care of you in retirement, Social Security and Medicare are under more strain than ever. The promise that if you just follow the rules, everything will work out, a lot of people stopped believing that a long time ago. What's coming instead is probably something more chaotic, but potentially more resilient. More people starting businesses instead of climbing corporate ladders. More communities creating their own support systems instead of depending on government programs. More families living multi-generationally and helping each other instead of everyone isolating in their own separate houses. That might sound like we're going backward, but maybe we're actually going forward in a different direction than we expected. Maybe the hyper-individualized, institution-dependent model that dominated the last several decades wasn't sustainable, and we're discovering older patterns of living that actually work better. Trump's not causing that shift, he's a symptom of it and an accelerant. His announcement is one more signal that the old way of doing things is ending, and we're in the messy transition period where nobody's quite sure what comes next. So here's what I'd tell anyone listening right now. We're standing at the edge of another turning point where politics and economics and technology and culture all intersect in ways that only happen a few times in a generation. Trump's announcement is more than just political theater. It's a mirror. It shows us what we fear, what we value, what we're willing to fight for, and what we might become if we stop paying attention. You've lived through a lot of change already. You've seen the world transform in ways nobody could have predicted when you were younger, and you've adapted and survived and built good lives through all of it. This next wave of change is coming, whether we're ready or not. But the good news is, you already have the most important skill, the ability to adapt. Don't let the chaos overwhelm you. Don't let the negativity on the news make you think everything's falling apart. Things are changing, yes, but change creates opportunity just as much as it creates risk. And the people who do best in times like these are the ones who stay curious, stay critical, stay connected to their communities, and keep thinking for themselves instead of letting others do their thinking for them. Trump's strategy, whatever you think of him personally, is to position himself as the leader who understands that change is coming and has a plan for it. Whether his plan is the right one, whether he can actually execute it, whether it help or hurt regular Americans, those are all legitimate questions. Ask them. Demand answers. Hold every leader accountable, not just the ones you disagree with. And if you found this breakdown helpful, if it gave you a different way of thinking about what's really happening beneath all the noise, do me a favor, hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment telling me what you think is really coming. Because honestly, the conversation isn't ending here, it's just beginning. We're all trying to make sense of this moment together. Your perspective matters. Your experience matters. The wisdom you've gained from living through previous turning points in history, that's exactly what we need more of right now. We need voices of people who remember when things were genuinely difficult before and figured out how to get through it anyway. So share your thoughts. Let's learn from each other. Because whatever comes next, we'll navigate it better together than we will isolated and afraid.